Hello everyone. So, just a bit of a primer as to what's going to happen now. So, most of you may have picked up on the clues that I'm working on a novel. Now, it's still in the draft stages, and it's going to have to be heavily cut down. But, for the sake of posterity, I've decided to do the draft one chapter at a time in a sort of audiobook fashion, just to keep a record of it, and anybody that wants to keep up on what it's like won't have to go through the bother of reading it. They can just listen to it while doing other things. So, to that end, I'm going to begin with Chapter 1. The book, as yet, is unnamed. Only Chapter 1 has a name. That's probably going to change. So, this is very much a draft. You guys are my alpha testers. So, without further ado, let's begin. His body ached as he shifted in his seat, the rumble of the coach intruding on the music he was trying to listen to. His head lay languidly on the headrest as he gazed rightward into the middle distance through the coach's window. It was somewhat relaxing, albeit repetitive. The seemingly endless fields ready for sowing interspersed with the signage one would expect from the motorway the bus was riding on. The ache in his body was accompanied by giddiness, the novelty of optimism still having not worn off. He found himself worrying, that thought sinking in. He was used to things going wrong, not going right. He hurriedly reached into his jacket pockets, finding his wallet, phone and passport, and with a sigh of relief he chided himself. He was being more positive now. He had checked everything. There was no need to panic. Just to feel secure, he opened the wallet briefly. The meagre amount of money he possessed was mostly in there. Very little worth of mentioning remaining in his bank account. His phone was fine, given its age. It was still a smartphone with the apps one would expect, though with its unimpressive hardware it was hardly competitive. Lastly came the passport, his only official ID. He flicked open to the page with his details and looked at the picture and wished that he could update it. He had always thought his face looked fat in pictures and in fact did so again as his rounded face stared back at him. His beard was more overgrown in the picture, which made his face look longer. It's why he always grew out the beard in some way, as well as leaving his hair long, albeit spiked upwards, whenever he could to add more length. He looked at the brown hair in the picture and wondered if he should dye it. The grey streaks at the sides were somewhat distinguished, but he'd had grey hair since he was 19 and considered it cheating on his hair's behalf. With his own greyish-blue eyes staring back at him, he turned to the name. His name. Alex Swain. Yep, he said to himself, tucking the possessions back into his pocket. Everything was all as it should be. Her head was in her palms as she sat, waiting for the answer to arrive. The chair she sat on was uncomfortable, a cheap plastic burden, but it had come with the room. The laptop wasn't much of anything, but at least that was hers. It was enough for Discord to work, which was all she cared about right now. She was nervous and needed some encouragement. She flicked between the other rooms on the server she frequented most, where she had met the friend that she was waiting to hear from. Beginner English chat, she read, clicking on it. They were very good, she mused. She would never have known that they weren't native speakers. She felt a pang of pessimism at the realization she had been struggling with her Japanese. Her time in beginner Japanese chat recently had been marred by corrections, which had made her heart sink. With her starting a new course the next day, nerves had begun to overwhelm her. The program pinged her out of her revelry as the reply came through. With a sigh of relief, she clicked on the icon accompanying the name Momoe. I failed the exams, Sophie-chan, it read. Sophie's heart sank once more. She abandoned all notions of seeking advice and leaned back, her face in her palms, as she groaned in frustration. How could she help Momoe? She leaned forwards once more with a sigh and decided to start with the basics. Are you okay? She began with. She hit enter as it dawned on her that it wasn't the most useful of questions, but she didn't have much to go on. Momoe had been hoping to gain entry onto a computer science course, which had involved a pair of grueling entrance exams. It wasn't that Momoe wasn't good at the subject, Sophie reflected. It was because Momoe had settled for something that she thought was sensible, rather than following her dream. It was a dream that Momoway had guarded carefully, and it was a privilege for Sophie to know of it, she thought. Would it be a good time to bring it up? Or should she encourage her to continue with being sensible? The Discord interface alerted Sophie as she noticed that the words "Momoway is typing" had appeared at the bottom. The seconds dragged as Sophie waited. "I'm not sure," came the reply. "I've got a lot on my mind." Sophie knew that feeling well, the moment when innumerable stresses all converged and wound up being too much to process. Well, she wouldn't recommend her usual cures to Momoway. She imagined that recommending alcohol or marijuana to a Japanese 19-year-old would not go down well. "Do you have a way to distract yourself?" Sophie ventured, typing eagerly. "Try taking a long shower or go to one of those onsen I'm so jealous of." Sophie hoped that the slight joke would stir Mum away from the depression she was sure her friend would be feeling. Sophie checked the time quickly, navigating to the taskbar as she dragged 2 clock apps to the front. One was set to her time, and the other was set to Mumaway's. It was noon on Sophie's end, and 8 p.m. on Mumaway's. It meant that dinner would likely be called for soon, as Mumaway's parents usually did. "Have you talked to your parents about it yet?" Sophie ventured. She ran the risk of reminding Mumaway of one more stress, of letting down loved ones that believed in her, but it was worth asking, she thought. "Mumaway is typing" appeared again, shortly followed by, "A little. They've been kind. I'm just overwhelmed." A moment later the statement was followed up with an adorable-looking emote of a crying hamster. "Go have a nice dinner with your parents," Sophie typed. "Your parents are actually cool, so just relax, and it'll come to you when you're thinking about it the least." After a few seconds, Sophie added, "It's called the shower principle. Google it, or Bing it, or whatever." After a few seconds of no reply, Sophie wondered if that had been the right thing to suggest. She had no other ideas. She wanted to support her friend somehow, a friend who had supported her in the past. She would never have predicted becoming friends with Mumaway beforehand, but now that it had happened, she wanted to lift her spirits. She decided to type once more. "Whatever happens, I believe in you." Ganbatane! Has she typed that right? Was it Ganbatane or Ganbatayo? She had opened one of her cheat sheets. Her laptop had significant space dedicated to many text, doc, and PDF files, full of guides to speaking and writing Japanese. Her written Japanese was something she struggled with. Her dyslexia certainly didn't help. She was looking forward to the course beginning soon. Then the nerves swamped her once more, like a cascading blanket of disappointment wrapping her from all sides. Her shoulders slumped as she wondered how she could encourage Mumaway without even being able to encourage herself. "I'm sorry," she brought herself to type. "I don't know if that's cliched or not. I'm sorry if I'm not helping." Sophie felt a need to distract herself now. She considered putting on some music, but couldn't bring herself to choose something. She found herself reaching to the right behind her where her bed was. She had to lean her chair back slightly, but retrieved the large book upon which were rolling implements. She settled herself down, placing the book upon her lap. Taking one of the small papers from its box, she opened the bag of tobacco. She raised her head to check the screen. No reply. She arranged a thin line of tobacco along the middle of the narrow paper, making sure to deposit the excess back into its bag, as well as leaving a gap on the right-hand side of the paper into which a filter would go. With that done, she reached for said filters, which came in a thin, white box. She fished out one of the narrow white tubes from which she squeezed a singular filter. Putting everything back where she had found it, Sophie added the filter to the gap and picked up the paper, rolling the tube together from the bottom. With only a small amount of unrolled paper left, she delicately licked the edge of the paper before completing the roll. With that, she placed a cigarette in her mouth and reached for the lighter from her desk. Just as Sophie was about to use the lighter, she saw "Mumaway is typing" again. She felt a beat of happiness at this and found herself chuckling at the thought of it. Having a reliable and trustworthy friend was still something of a novelty to her. She decided not to dwell on it, lest she be overcome with emotion. She already had her new course to worry about. She felt her shoulders sag at the thought of it. She didn't like stress. She shook her head as she lifted the lighter, closed her eyes, and lit the cigarette. She breathed in deeply, the menthol filter adding a refreshing taste to the ultimately terrible habit. She knew this wasn't good for her, but she just didn't care. She opened her eyes to look at the screen. It's okay. I'm glad I can talk to you, Sophie-chan. I'll talk to my parents over dinner. I don't know what I'll do, but I think I can do my best and figure it out. Sophie found herself smiling. Momoe could be adorable sometimes. Sophie found Momoe's youthful optimism inspiring and had borne witness to how it had helped her overcome her problems in school. Sophie mused, not for the first time, that she was a little jealous of Momoe's ability to do that. In some ways, Momoe reminded Sophie of the youth she hadn't been able to experience. Sophie closed her eyes and grumbled as she took another draw of a cigarette. The last thing she needed was to dwell on her misspent youth, something she could never recapture. It was nice to see Momoe do it, though. Sophie breathed out with a sigh. She'd felt privileged to have befriended this girl, to see her overcome the odds. She was the reason that Sophie had enrolled in the upcoming course, the course which started the next day. Panic and a blanket of depression came descending once again as Sophie found her head lowered. She took another draw and leaned back, her eyes closed as she breathed in deeply. She was fine, she reminded herself. She knew what she was doing. There was no need to panic. She found that repeating that to herself helped. She opened her eyes and breathed out to see Momoe add, "Are you excited for tomorrow?" With laboured breath, Alex heaved the luggage across the threshold to his new flat, a terraced house flanked by a dozen or so similar houses on either side. As he stepped into the narrow corridor that made up the entryway, he paused to briefly rest. His hands ached from dragging the wheeled, though heavy suitcase. Switching hands frequently during the trip had done little to help. He didn't have much further to go, needing only now to manoeuvre the heavy case up the stairs in front of him. He had explored the house when he had viewed it previously, brief though that occasion was. Looking up the corridor, he could venture up the stairs, hugging the left wall, which he would in a moment, or he could walk past the stairs where a ground-floor bedroom, dining room, kitchen and bathroom could be found. Having gathered his strength, Alex took a firm grip of the luggage with both hands and lifted. With annoyed grunts, Alex carried the suitcase up the stairs. It took more effort, but it was quicker, he had decided. He carried the case with both arms above his head, his muscles burning with the effort. But it had been worth it, as he dumped it back down at the top of the stairs with a satisfied grunt moments later. The bare wood floor rang with the impact. The landlord seemed in no hurry to finish renovating the house, Alex mused. The planked floors were decrepit, casually dusted with a grey-green mould, and the walls, probably once painted white, were now an off-yellow. With his journey almost complete, Alex turned to his right, where the door to his room was. Fishing his new key from his pocket, he glanced to his left. He could see the locked door to one other bedroom, with another room currently obscured by the corner of his room. Unlocking his door, he stepped in. The room was sparsely decorated, furnished with a cheap and decaying double bed directly opposite the door, facing the window to Alex's right. The windows were uncurtained and light streamed in, highlighting the dust that danced through the air disturbed by Alex's entry. Alex closed the door behind him, heaving the luggage with a grunt to the middle of the room, where he could walk around it. In front of the window was an unstable-looking plastic desk, caked in dust. Alex walked towards it, passing a modestly sized wardrobe that leaned unstably against the wall. Alex ran his finger through the dust on the desk, leaving a trail that indicated that this room had not been cleaned in quite some time. "Well," he said to himself with a sigh, "it's a start." Momoe picked at her food, unable to bring herself to eat. She sighed to herself as she prodded at the teriyaki salmon with her chopsticks. "You're not hungry, Momoe?" her mother said, concerned. She looked up at her parents as they ate. They were all sitting at the dinner table in the living room, but Momoe wasn't feeling as sociable as she would like. Her shyness had been a detriment to her sociability, her parents being the only exception. Today, though, she felt especially like being left alone. "It's okay to be disappointed, Momoe," her father said softly, "but you need to keep your strength up if you're going to try again." The words hadn't been as encouraging as Momoe imagined her father had intended them to be. She decided to bite the bullet and be honest. "I feel rather lost right now, Oto-san." Momoe took a piece of the salmon between the chopsticks and gave it a tentative bite. The recipe was a favourite, but today it felt underwhelming. "I don't think that I'm ready to try again." It had been the second time she had failed the entrance exams. She had first taken them in April and had found herself disappointed with the failure, but willing to try again. Failing the resits had broken her somewhat, though, and she found herself questioning everything. Now she had a year with no obvious goal in mind, save for going to cram school to try again the following year. "What will you do instead?" her mother asked. Momoe could tell that her parents were trying to suppress their own disappointment and be supportive. In response to the question, she shook her head silently. She knew what she wanted to do, but she had been too afraid to pursue her dream. She had instead chosen to pursue a career that she knew to be sensible, however unfulfilling. She wasn't sure how to process the loss. The one thing she wanted to do was too risky, and the sensible path now seemed closed to her. Her parents looked at each other, their looks of concern silently communicating their intent. "Well," her mother answered, "for now, try to take your mind off it. You've hit a wall, so to speak, and banging your head against it won't help." "Your mother's right," her father followed. "Take some time to rest and reflect. We'll be here for you in the meantime." Momoe weakly attempted a smile and nodded. She had no idea what to reflect on, but accepted the opportunity to rest. She felt weary and drained. Silently, she forced herself to eat, appreciating the wisdom in her father's advice. Each bite felt like an effort, but she knew that she would need to come up with a plan soon, and didn't need malnourishment to hinder things further. The thought of what would come next felt like a weight smothering her. "Maybe you could talk to your friend," her mother opined. "I already did," Momoe answered sadly. What she didn't say was that she had changed the subject to avoid thinking about it further. "I see," her father answered. "Well, just take your time. We have faith in you, Momoe. The answer will come to you." Momoe smiled, this time genuinely feeling the emotion behind it. She looked to her parents one at a time as she spoke. "Thank you, Aka-san, or To-san. I think I'll do that." She paused for a moment before asking, "Do you mind if I eat in my room, please? I think I need to be alone." Her mother made a noise of consideration as she looked to Momoe's father. "Okay, just this once," she replied. "But don't make a habit of it." Momoe nodded glumly, standing. As much as she loved her parents, she felt the pressure from them to succeed, no matter how unintentional it might have been. She needed to be away from all expectations. Taking her plate and chopsticks, she nodded to her parents. "Thanks, again," she said, once again forcing a smile before exiting the room. Afternoon was becoming evening as Sophie hurried to get ready. There was little left for her to do, as she was already wearing her workplace's uniform, a pair of black trousers and a simple black polo shirt. Her hair was the task taking her attention. She sat on the chair by her desk, though had turned it rightward so that it was facing the full-length mirror standing against the wall. As she always did for work, she pulled back what was normally shoulder-length hair into a ponytail, holding it there with a thin blue hairband. She tilted her head as she mused on her reflection. She had dyed her hair pink not long ago, but her natural brown roots were already showing, and she found herself wondering if the effort to re-dye it later would be worth it. She decided that she probably would get round to redoing it at some point. The pink hair had been an experiment which she had been pleased with, adding a vibrance that she felt her original brown hair lacked. She glanced at her phone, which lay on the desk in front of her, checking the time. She had an hour left before she would have to leave. She sighed deeply, not looking forward to her shift. Working in a rock club had been interesting at first, but the grind of it all was beginning to wear her down. She was glad that her new course started so late in the day, as her shift wouldn't end until 2 a.m. She didn't want to imagine what things would have been like if she'd had to go into her class at a normal time after such a slog. With a sense of foreboding, she set about with the next task, her makeup. While Sophie sometimes appreciated the possibilities of makeup, today she felt that it was a burden that she would rather do without. She entertained the possibility of not bothering, but felt self-conscious. With another sigh, she reached for the makeup bag on her desk and decided to just get on with it. The first to be retrieved from the bag was the primer. Sophie opened the cap on the tube and squeezed out a small amount of the white, creamy substance, depositing it on her cheek. She did the same again and again until she had similar white spots on both of her cheeks, forehead, nose, and chin. Satisfied, she rubbed the product into her skin, smoothing it out over her face until she could no longer see it. With that done came the foundation, as Sophie retrieved the next product from her bag. Opening the tube, she squeezed a small amount of the beige liquid onto the back of her hand and dotted it around her skin before spreading it onto her face with a soft, oval brush which she retrieved from her bag. Checking the mirror, she could see that she was almost done with the foundation, needing only to refine it further. She reached into the bag and withdrew a spongy bowl roughly the size of a chicken egg, as well as a small bottle of sprayable water. Turning the spray on the ball, she dampened it slightly, before gently dabbing and spreading with the ball. As she did, the foundation began to look more natural, and she began to feel pleased with herself. As much as she resented the time and effort required to do her makeup, she couldn't help but feel better when she looked better. Still, she wasn't finished yet, and moved on to plucking another implement from the bag. This time, she was going to focus on the eyebrows. The tool was thin and stick-like, with an angled coil-like brush on the end. To go with it, she withdrew another implement, an eyebrow pen. The tip had two sides to it, one waxy, and the other resembling a felt-tip pen. She drew the pen across her eyebrows with the waxy side first, with gentle, broad strokes. After repeating the action with her other eyebrow, she found that they looked much thicker and smiled. She turned the pen-like device around to expose the other side and drew its tip along the bottom edge of the eyebrows. Almost done with that task, she took the stick with the coil and brushed the brows gently to smooth out the colouring, to make it look more natural. Once she was satisfied with how it looked, Sophie returned the tools to her bag and reached in for the next ones. First was a broad, flat swatch divided into 10 compartments, each containing a different colour of a chalk-like substance. Then came the brush that accompanied it, which resembled an artist's paintbrush. She pondered for a moment, selecting a colour. Eventually she decided on a dusky pink, dabbing the brush into the substance and brushing it gently across her eyelids. With that done, she took a narrower brush and did the same for the lower edges of her eyes. One colour down, she mused, her attention returning to the swatch as she picked the next colour. Settling on the cocoa shade, she took the brush and added the mixture to the creases in her eyelids and outer corners. After that, she brushed the eyelids with a larger brush, blending the colours to make them seem more natural. Looking in the mirror, Sophie decided that she wasn't finished and returned to the swatch. With the precision of years of practice, she picked at colours as she added subtler tones to what was already on her face. Next came the part that she hated, the eyeliner. Begrudgingly, she took the eyeliner pen from her bag and carefully began to draw along the very edges of her eyelids. One wrong move and the pen would poke her in the eye, something she had always hated. After several moments of careful drawing, she was done and ready to move on to the next task. Sophie reached into the bag once more and withdrew the mascara. Gazing at her reflection in the mirror, she opened the container, pulling out the thin brush and gently ran it upwards through her eyelashes. The black substance on the brush clung to them, making the lashes seem bolder and more noticeable. She paused for a moment and sat back on the chair, bored of the tedium of it all. But she had to persevere. As much as she loathed the time it took to perform this daily task, she both appreciated the finished effect and abhorred the reaction when she didn't bother. Society expected her to wear makeup, which she thought was unfair. And when she didn't wear it, she was often accused of looking tired or ill. She groaned to herself. It wasn't fair, she insisted silently to herself, and found herself pouting a little. Still, she had to continue since she'd started the job and moved on to the concealer. Sighing, she reached for the container and opened it, dabbing a brush into the beige powder and spreading it under her eyes in wide arcs. After that, she spread the concealer on her chin and forehead. The difference in colour was slight, but noticeable to one so practiced. With that done, she took the mascara once more, now drawing it downwards on her lower eyelashes, giving them the same bold effect as the upper ones. Satisfied with the lashes, it was time for the bronzer. She took one of her larger brushes and dabbed it into the container. It was another chalky substance, and Sophie tapped the brush lightly to shake off the excess powder. She couldn't put too much on. The bronzer had to be subtle. She brushed the bronzer across her cheeks and saw the colour darken a little. After that, she retrieved her blusher, a similar substance, albeit a warm pink colour. Taking the brush again, she dipped it into the blusher, tapping off the excess, and spread it lightly over her cheeks, affording them a subtle but pleasing rosy hue. Her skin was almost done, she decided with some satisfaction. She could finish with some highlighter, then move on to her lipstick. Again, it was another powdered mix, and Sophie dipped in her brush. She tapped the brush to shake away the excess and gently smoothed the substance over her cheeks, the inner corners of her eyes, and the tip of her nose. Finally done with her skin, Sophie reached for the lip liner and began tracing the edges of her lips, giving them a more defined edge. Satisfied, she reached for the lipstick and chose a pink that would match her hair, delicately drawing it across her lips before pursing her lips in a kiss-like motion to check the look. She sighed in relief. She was done. She checked the clock on her phone and despaired at the time it had taken. Even though she had done this almost every day, the 20 minutes that it took to do it seemed like too much time wasted sometimes. Still, she was done, so there was no sense in complaining. She wanted to rub her eyes in tiredness and frustration, but held back the urge, unwilling to repeat the makeup process again. She checked her reflection and nodded. She looked good, at least, she thought. Standing, she turned her chair so that it was once again facing the desk and sat down again. She didn't have long before she would have to leave, so she decided to turn on her laptop and browse the web for a while. The work was tedious, and Alex regretted having started. The desk had been the first thing he had cleaned, dusting the surface as best as he could. Lacking the proper cleaning implements, a dusting was the best that he could do. Now he was dealing with the carpet, having found an aging vacuum cleaner on the ground floor. It barely worked, the cumbersome device taking several passes to properly clear any given area, and Alex found himself annoyed. With a groan he continued, moving the device back and forth as he did his best to clear away what was apparently months of dust. He had always found cleaning to be not only tedious but stressful. What were ordinary domestic tasks to others reminded Alex of the abuse he had suffered in his childhood, and he struggled to banish the memories whenever he cleaned. A flash of memory occurred to him, this time a moment of being a small boy roughly 6 years old, curled up in the fetal position as his mother violently beat him, both of them screaming. He shook his head and shivered, dropping the vacuum cleaner to the floor. He rubbed his eyes, struggling to collect himself. Alex wondered how his life would have turned out had things been different. Sighing, he gave up on cleaning for the moment and sat down on the bed. In that moment he felt awful as he reflected on his life and felt inadequate for someone of his age. 31, he muttered, shaking his head. 31 years old, and he was only just turning his life around. While he was happy that he had finally made this important step, he was disappointed that it had taken him so long. Still, he realized, he had made that first step. He had decided what he had wanted to do with his life, and he was now working towards it, albeit later than he would have liked. He closed his eyes and drew a deep breath. It was no good measuring himself against the achievements of others. All he could do was take one step at a time. Whilst he regretted that he was playing catch-up, he could at least be proud that he had finally started the process. With that, Alex stood again. He clenched his jaw tightly and narrowed his eyes as he picked up the vacuum cleaner and continued. He had to remember his determination, he thought. He had to remember why he was there and allow it to inspire him. As he pushed the cleaning device around the room, he thought of the course that he would be starting the next day. He would be learning Japanese, something he had tried in his youth but had given up on. That was another regret that he couldn't take back. He wondered what would have happened had he kept it up. Would he already be in Japan at that point? Would he have had a life there by now? He shook his head, doing his best to banish the thought from his mind. Ignore the regrets, he said aloud as he admonished himself. Just fucking ignore them. He couldn't, though. Granted, he had recently been inspired to turn his life around, and he was proud that he was making it a reality. But the regrets of age always lurked nearby, and it was difficult to tune them out. Realizing this, Alex growled with annoyance and turned off the vacuum cleaner. He needed to clear his head. He looked to his new desk, upon which lay a large book, covered with a pouch of rolling tobacco, a box of menthol filters, and rolling papers. He moved to the desk and laid the book over his knees. He needed a cigarette. First he took the papers, pulling one out of the sheets and laying it on the book. Next he took the pouch, opening it and withdrawing a pinch of the tobacco. Laying it on the paper, he arranged the dried leaf shreds in a line, leaving a gap on the right-hand side. Next, he took the box of filters and withdrew one of the tubes. Applying some pressure, Alex squeezed out one of the white cylinders and deposited it in the gap he had left on the rolling paper. With his finger, Alex pushed the paper towards the edge of the book with his left hand, holding the paper with his right hand as he picked it up and began to roll it into a thin tube shape. With the gummy edge of the paper facing him, Alex licked the paper lightly before completing the roll and putting the finished cigarette in his mouth. Satisfied, he reached into his pocket for his lighter and ignited the cigarette, taking a deep breath. He sat back on his chair, enjoying the menthol taste as the nicotine receptors in his brain feasted happily on this poisonous addiction. He flicked the ash from the burning edge of the cigarette into a nearby ashtray and wondered what the best way would be to clear his head. He mused that leaving the house for a while would probably be the best way to distract himself, but struggled to think of what to do. He didn't know Manchester very well, especially the area he was now living in. He was aware of the main city centre near the train station. He had not only scouted the area several weeks ago before moving, but had visited the city centre from time to time in the years previously. He could always go visit his new workplace, he thought. He had applied for several jobs before moving into the area, knowing that he would need an income as soon as possible. He didn't start for a few days, as he had wanted to allow himself time to acclimate, though that didn't mean that he couldn't visit as a customer. Whilst bar work wasn't something he had especially wanted to do, it was something he was experienced in and could turn his hand to without inducing too much stress. He thought about it for a minute. The rock club where he would be working may be a good place to relax in whilst getting to know the place. Alex smiled to himself. If he could come up with a plan that achieved multiple objectives, then he would usually pick that plan over all others. Deciding that a visit would probably help, he stood, his cigarette dangling out of the corner of his mouth. He checked that he had everything he would need. His wallet was in his pocket, as were his phone and keys. He tapped away more ash from the cigarette before moving about the room, putting on his jacket and searching through the luggage which lay partially unpacked next to the wardrobe. He opened one of the side compartments, withdrawing from it a box of nicotine patches. He had tried to quit previously, but found the stress too much to handle. In his latest effort, he had compromised and decided that he would only smoke at home, settling on using the patch whenever he went out. As Alex's cigarette dwindled, he applied the patch to his right arm, making sure that it was stuck securely. It wouldn't kick in for a little while, so he felt comfortable finishing his cigarette. Feeling a little better, Alex made ready to leave. So that is it for now. Wow, recording that took a lot longer than I thought it was going to do, as well as the editing. So this will take a while to do, but I think I want to continue. I'm not sure. Anyway, that is a sort of audiobook-ish version of my first draft. Well, part 1 of chapter 1. So, as I said before, this is a draft, so by the time the finished version comes round, that will have been cut down a lot, probably. I have no idea what that will look like yet, but that's probably what's going to happen. So, enjoy this bumper-length director's cut edition while you can. In the meantime, if you've just stumbled on this accidentally, I don't know how, this is unlisted, you can follow along in text form on my Discord, the link for which will be down below. And for anyone that's wondering, what the fuck is this? I usually do Let's Plays, so check them out if that's your thing. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining me, guys, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye now.